Okay, then we moving on to the hacking side of things, which seem to be our biggest focus today when it comes to what happens when somebody is breached. So when we started looking at various solutions, we found that there's hundreds of solutions in the market when it comes to proactively monitoring systems and things like that. However, most organizations still use two forms to monitor their systems on a day-to-day basis, which is either via a vulnerability assessment or if you're fortunate enough to have the financial backing to do penetration testing. With vulnerability assessments, this is basically just let's call it a high-level scan or overview from a system, which provides you with some subset of information. Where a penetration test obviously simulates a white hat hacker's attempt to break into a system and exploit specific vulnerabilities. Most organizations are going the vulnerability assessment route because it is quite cost effective and there's various tools out there. However, this is a great tool to use, but there are some limitations to it. So there's something called false positives within a vulnerability assessment. The reason for this is when a vulnerability scanner scans a system, it only has access to a subset of information or data, which basically can prevent it from giving you an accurate overview of what exploits are sitting behind specific things, or if there are specific measures put in place to make sure that those vulnerabilities can't be turned into specific exploits. And we're obviously doing this to prevent ransomware attacks from happening on a day-to-day basis, because this is something that is increasingly happening with most organizations on a day-to-day basis, and most organizations dread finding that one file on their system stating that they've been hacked. So from a ransomware perspective, there's three organizations that's probably been responsible for 65% of most attacks in the last 2.5 years, which is basically Conti, that's been mentioned a couple of times now, Revil and Avedon. Those are three of the major organizations that's basically attacking things on a day-to-day basis, trying to see how they can get into organization systems. Ransomware attacks have actually increased. In the last 2 years alone, it went up by 162%. In the last 4 years, it went up by 600%, which means people are more and more vulnerable because we've got more systems sitting on a network. We've got more users out there that's not necessarily trained in terms of how to handle specific data, how to handle sensitive data. You've got users, for instance, in a finance department that's trained to do a specific thing. They don't really care about the security around things. They don't really care about links, because when they get a link, well, let's click on it and see what happens. And that's the problem why a lot of the vulnerabilities increased in the last couple of years, as well as when we moved from a whole let's sit in our office and work to a work from home policy. It leaves a lot of individuals vulnerable because your network sitting in the office and your network sitting at home is vastly different. They say that there's a ransomware attack being launched globally every 11 seconds, and 70% of those vulnerability attacks are actually turned into full attacks, and it's actually accepted. When most organizations are breached, it's quite a costly exercise. It's between 18 and 25 million for the cost of remediation, and not just the cost of remediation, but also you get quite a bit of operational costs that need to be implemented. Additionally, you have reputational losses that's part of this whole exercise. And then they say when an organization has been breached, they will be down for at least 2 to 3 weeks and up to even months, depending on how big the organization itself is. And then obviously linking back to this, there's obviously fines and things as per what Tony discussed from the Cybersecurity Act. So we've decided to partner with an organization called Fortitude, where we're trying to remove the whole, let's call it, human element out of this as much as possible and introduce the advanced artificial intelligence. The reason for this is most IT organizations, you generally don't have time. You're limited in resources in terms of what you can use to monitor security threats on a day-to-day basis. You don't necessarily have the manpower for people to sit the whole day and monitor these threats and make specific changes and things like that. So it's a lot easier for you to look at dashboards and things like that to view exactly what's coming and what threats can potentially get into the system itself. Because you're trying to remove the human element out of the equation as much as possible, it also eliminates errors to be introduced into the system on a day-to-day basis. And then the third thing, which is quite important for us and which is quite nice, is Fortitude is developed and it resides locally in South Africa. So when it comes to deploying of these systems, there's obviously, as mentioned, various systems out there that do vulnerability assessments. However, what the system does is when it gets deployed, it tries to understand exactly what your environment is about. It then replicates to understand everything connecting into that specific environment. Then it will actually start pushing vulnerabilities through to see if it can find vulnerabilities on the system itself, and then checking to see if those vulnerabilities can then be turned into physical exploits. And then it not only provides you with reports to say that these are your problems, so then your IT department has to go back and say, okay, well, how do we fix these problems? But the system also provides you with some form of recommendation to say that this is how we recommend you fix these problems that we've discovered on your system. The system itself can then also do penetration tests from the outside network in, as well as it can do internal penetration testing itself, to make sure that you are secure not only from a application and network perspective, but it tests various other elements as well, APIs as well as IoT devices sitting on your network. And that is actually quite important because that's where most organizations are quite vulnerable. I don't know when last any organization has loaded an antivirus on their printers, smart TVs sitting in an office. So all of those information gets sent back to a central repository, and everything needs to be safe connecting into that specific device or module, or third-party APIs connecting into a specific organization. So as mentioned, a lot of organizations are lucky enough to have penetration testers or get third-party penetration testers in, which is great. This whole experience will actually augment and double-check a lot of the things for them, so they can double-check again to make sure that these vulnerabilities and things are in place. However, the limitation with a penetration tester is, one, they obviously need to eat, sleep, go on leave, only work a subset amount of hours on a day-to-day basis. Where with an AI system, it runs 24/7, 365. It can constantly monitor and check new updates. Secondly, when it comes to the actual reporting side of things, once a penetration tester starts a test, they do a whole subset of tests, and then only they provide you with a report, let's call it at the end of 2 or 3 weeks once the testing is finished. Where with Fortitude, you can pull a report as and when you need it on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, depending on how often you need it, or you can just log in and look at the dashboard to see what the live state of things are like. When it also comes to the compliance of things, it assists you with various elements around that. And then your last limitation that I would say, the problem with most penetration testers is there's a certain way that they've been taught to do specific testing. So it's almost like you're struggling to make an ethical person think like an unethical person. Where with this, they usually have a list of, let's call it a script and things that they run on a day-to-day basis. Where with Fortitude, it trolls the internet and the dark web on a day-to-day basis to make sure it learns and it's up to date with the latest techniques and methods in terms of hacking and penetration testing, so it can implement that as part of the whole test simulation. So to give you an example of this, if it picks up online that there's a new penetration test that can be implemented on, let's call it a Sage environment, as soon as the discovery phase is finished and it picked up, okay, this organization is actually running some form of Sage, it can implement it as part of that to make sure that if they are secure in any form or way when it comes to that's part of the actual Sage vulnerabilities that is available out there. So this is just some of the differences between having a physical penetration tester and the system itself, how it can actually assist you. How the system actually works is it's licensed per IP or domain. It gets loaded onto the system. There's various checks that we do before the audit actually starts, making sure that the person authorizing us is actually authorized to do authorizing us to do the actual audit itself and things like that. Sorry.
Yeah, question. You say that Fortitude trolls the internet and the dark web to look for these techniques. How does it prevent itself from being hacked?
So there's various security measures and tools put in place to make sure it is also secure. I know there's been some attempts on the server itself from what the discussions that I've had with the guys. And after a while, the system actually understood what was going on, where somebody tried to hack the system and it reverse engineered and hacked whoever was hacking it back. So there's various tools and measures put in place to prevent this from happening. Another question.
Thanks so much. I think my question is really around the back end of Fortitude. I was just wondering around performance, because I think for me as a data scientist, I'd be very interested to track the performance of the underlying algorithm, because you're dealing with heuristic algorithms that are essentially working off of hypotheses. So I'd be very interested to find out and track what the performance of the underlying algorithm behind Fortitude is. As you know, there's many instances of false positives and the like. So what is the probability that we may be misled by Fortitude because the underlying algorithm might not be performing as it should?
So there are various people within Fortitude, an organization that's monitoring the system on a day-to-day basis, also making sure that the system is on the right path, basically pointing it towards specific things to say that, yes, this is picking it up as false positives and this is what the system is suggesting, as well as then pointing it towards specific things to say that, okay, the system saying these things are actually vulnerabilities, and they just double checking, yes, it is a vulnerability, or no, this is just common things or discussions that's within. It's almost like preventing the whole, let's call it Terminator situation from happening, making sure machines don't take over.
Sure. And as an end user client, would I have access to those reports, the benchmark testing, for example?
Yeah, James.
Sorry, I'm Lawrence. I'm part of the Fortitude team. I'm here for technical support. So we can provide benchmarking depending on what is needed, but because we developed everything ourselves, we have run multiple benchmarks and ensure that it is extremely lightweight on the environment, and the AI, the advanced AI, is not impacting any production environment. It will sit on the network and understand that the whole network is a production environment, that it mustn't go and start executing exploits and causing takedowns. So then it can basically go and understand, it sits, understands your whole network, understands what's coming in and out. It knows that it's a production environment, if it's a dev environment, if it is a honeypot and so on. Then from there, it goes and analyzes, okay, how much traffic should it put on the system? Will it impact the productivity? Because if it sees that, oh, your traffic or your bandwidth is in the evenings 5%, and in daytime 90%, it knows that, okay, it mustn't go and do the audit in the daytime and must do it in the evening time more heavily. It will just do some basic monitoring through the day, then in the evening start to implement the actual audit. Then on the AI side, we have all the full benchmarking reports that, if need be, we can provide. But basically, it is extremely lightweight. You don't have to install or put a box into your network. The only thing is, if you're doing internal auditing, you will have to install an agent, and all that it is basically a proxy jump point for the AI to get onto the network to do the auditing. No problem.
Thanks, Lawrence. So as mentioned, you can log in and view the dashboards on a day-to-day basis. It's a standard login portal where you can then see various groups. So for instance, you can then segregate that into different things within the organization. So for instance, if you've got different departments, various things that you want to test, you can segregate that so that IT administrators then have the correct access to look at specific things that they only allow to look at. Once then you log in and you select one of those groups, it gives you a nice list of the actual IP addresses that's being tested. When it shows blue, it means it's still in initialization phase. It's learning, understanding exactly what it is that it's auditing. As soon as it then starts discovering vulnerabilities and exploits, it'll start changing color to say that these things are vulnerabilities. We need to start looking at these. And then you can go into specific details from the dashboard there to view various things. Or if you just prefer pulling the reports to get the information, you can then pull the reports to get the necessary information that's required. From a report side of things, there's various reports that you get. One of it is a PDF report, basically looking similar to this. The top section of this report is basically cut off. That is the customer information around who's being audited. Then it gives you a nice summary there stating the amount of IP addresses or domains that's being tested, the amount of ports, amount of application services and API call-ins that's being tested. And then from a services and system perspective, it provides you with how many of them are secure, how many of them are warnings or vulnerabilities, and then how many of them are actually critical exploits that can have a critical impact on your business. Then as soon as you scroll down further into the report, if something is secure, it'll just basically point it out as gray. What is the information around what's being tested from an OS perspective, ports, those kind of things, and then that nothing was discovered. If there's a vulnerability, it'll turn it orange or amber, basically displaying same top-end information, then the information around what the discovery is, and then the bottom part of it is the remediation in terms of what it recommends you do to fix it. And then similar to the exploit, it'll just turn it red to tell you exactly what the vulnerabilities are. When it comes to the overall dashboard, this is something generally for, let's call it management, to look at, to give them just a good overview to say, are we currently compliant or do we have some issues on the system itself? So it gives you a nice timeline on the top left corner there to see when specific vulnerabilities were discovered and what the current state is like.
I just want to understand, how do you differentiate between a warning and critical service? So you've done your vulnerability assessment. How do you differentiate between those two findings?
Between the two. Okay, so a vulnerability is usually a warning or something that it's a problem into the system. It might be just an update that needs to run, but it might not necessarily have a critical impact on your day-to-day business. Where exploit is something that can have critical impact on your business on a day-to-day basis. Or somebody can take over your system or extreme measures like, for instance, zero-day vulnerabilities and things like that. So next, gives you...
Sorry, one more question. So does the system have APIs available so that you can integrate into typical source systems so that you can write your logs to, for example, a SIM? Because you know we all like
Yes.
to have all our information together.
Of course.
and then lastly, is there integration into, for example, your patching system so that you are able to, from your dashboard, patch a vulnerability?
Yes. Lawrence, you want to elaborate on that?
Okay, so because we develop everything ourselves, if you need any specific type of integration into SIEM SOC source, we can integrate into Splunk and so on, open SIEMs and so on. So it's up to you. You guys can contact Stephan, and from there we can either help you integrate either to this SIEM, or if you want to report info from the SOC SIEM source to us. And then also, basically we can just communicate and make it quite a seamless experience.
Awesome. So, and then obviously from the top right corner, it shows that if you are compliant or not to the various things, depending on obviously the outcome. If something is discovered on the network, the little crest that is currently green will turn red, and it will give you a completely different view stating exactly what is the priorities that you need to fix from a dashboard overview, giving you some critical information from the system itself at that current point in time. So one of the things that I would like to highlight specifically is we've done various tests on organizations and things, and one of the most common things that we've picked up is especially on e-commerce or online portal sites. And the reason for this is when a lot of penetration testers test the site, they test things on the site itself. Like for instance, can I change the price? Can I change the image on something? But they don't necessarily test APIs that's connecting or calling into the actual website itself. And this is usually where the biggest problem resides. What I mean by that is when an organization has got an online portal or a e-commerce site, they are responsible for the content that's actually on the device itself, or on the site itself rather, and everything to do with the site. But they are not responsible for the payment side of things. This is usually outsourced to organizations that handle secure payments and things like that, where you usually get some form of page to fill in credit card information and things to make sure that is secure. However, even if something is secure from a payment perspective, there's still some form of API communication between the actual payment gateway and the website itself, letting it know, yes, a payment was made and the payment is successful, or no, credit card information provided is incorrect. For those that's not so technical, what happens basically is on a website is there's backend script that runs and gets sent back to a central server. So usually what will happen is there's a specific transactional code that gets sent based on what happened on the front end. So say for instance you completed credit card information there that is not correct or accurate. A message will be sent back. You'll see the last line on the pay request. It'll say transaction status with the number 2, which basically means the transaction is denied because the credit card information is incorrect. What happens in this instance is Fortitude goes in and it'll actually see if it can manipulate the code that gets sent. So if your system is correctly integrated on the API, it would return back with the error once the manipulation took place. So for instance, in this case, we changed the transaction code from a 2 to a 1. So if everything is correctly in place, it should give back an error stating something changed on the system and it's not correct. But in this case, what we found with a lot of organizations is the actual payment went through when incorrect credit card information was submitted. So you receive the communication stating that it is paid, and nextly you'll actually get some confirmation to say that thank you for your order. And this is the problem with the integrations, because obviously when things are tested, it's being tested in silos and departments to say that, yes, my website is 100%, it's accurate, it's correct, but the API call-ins is not necessarily what gets tested. So this is how we would like to help and assist you with making sure that your complete security state or posture within your organization is 100% secure. Thank you very much.